Usually we're looking at interesting, iconic or forgotten designs. The Yak-28 is a bit of everything. It was mass-produced, yet has almost been completely forgotten. It had good specs on paper, but in practice, it was a different story. It was also a cool-looking aircraft unless you actually got into it, at which point you were flying one of the most unstable, delicate jets the Soviets ever built, yet one that formed a crucial component of the Air Force for many years. If you want to journey a little deeper into topics like this, then join us at peacemaker.net.au for ad-free early access, extended material and more. That's peacemaker.net.au. See you there.
During the early 1950s, the Soviets found themselves in need of a newer, faster tactical bomber, something small enough to fly interdiction missions in a war zone, yet still large enough to carry a decent payload. While other similar designs existed, none were truly groundbreaking. Soviet focus since the war had been on other areas, mainly strategic bombers, which were needed as a geopolitical tool to hedge against Strategic Air Command's fleet and fighters for defensive denial. From a geostrategic standpoint, medium-range strike aircraft were of moderate importance. The most important bases to cover were long-range strategic reach, achieved through specialized bombers and later missiles, and defensive area denial, achieved through interceptors, fighters, and ground-based air defenses. Yet, from a non-political tactical perspective, on the battlefield, strike aircraft were clearly beneficial. They could support troops, fly interdiction missions, and so on. On March 28, 1956, the Soviet government issued requirements to the Experimental Design Bureau of Yakovlev for a new twin-seat tactical bomber. The requirements called for a 55,000-foot service ceiling, a top speed of Mach 1.2, a range of at least 2,200 kilometers, 1,360 miles, with a 2,600-pound payload and a maximum payload of 6,600 pounds. A follow-up requirement followed shortly after, on August 21st, something the government had become infamous for in the 50s. It called for a second derivative as well, this time with a Mach 2 top speed, a 68,000-foot service ceiling, and a range of 2,500 kilometers, or 1,550 miles. Development would begin soon after. Designated Yak-129, the concept was similar in shape to the Sud Aviation Vautour, but powered by two powerful afterburning Tumansky R-11 turbojets. With outboard engine nacelles, a conventional bomb bay, a glazed nose, and 45-degree swept wings, it was visually interesting to say the least. Ultimately, the shaping was far from groundbreaking, possibly a decision to conserve R&D time and get the aircraft into production quickly. Yet, while it relied on existing design principles, including conventional shaping rather than area ruling, trouble was noted from the outset. Assembly was to be carried out at the Irkutsk Aviation Industrial Association factory. One veteran engineer at the plant later remarked that no other aircraft had raised so many questions in regard to machining and assembly. What was ostensibly a simple project soon became complex. Nevertheless, assembly of preliminary mock-ups continued. The first working prototype would take to the skies on March 5, 1958. From existing accounts, the flight was successful, with the aircraft showing decent handling at lower speeds and good takeoff and landing performance. Again, refinements were made, including adding ridges on the wing roots for further stability and refining the materials used for the leading edge slats and slotted flaps. The primary issue designers noted was the engines. The nacelle design produced drag and was inefficient at taking in air at high speeds. During later testing, pilots reported that acceleration was so slow due to this induced drag that the aircraft struggled to even reach Mach 1 before hitting bingo fuel. Redesigns were carried out several times, but, so the story goes, before a new nacelle had been completed, the lead designer had passed the aircraft on for state testing and approval. The finalized product that emerged would differ little from the final prototype. It retained the same Vautour-style appearance, glazed nose, and strongly swept wing. the aircraft first appeared in full public view in 1961. Analysts in the US initially believed it was probably a fighter, but soon realized it was a bomber. The New York Times went so far as to claim that America had nothing to match it. Despite the overstatement, it was still a breakthrough in some ways. It would be one of the first mass-produced bombers in the Soviet Union capable of supersonic flight, albeit only at altitude, emerging after the Tu-22, and was technically the Soviets' first supersonic, nuclear-capable strike aircraft in mass production.
Yet calling it a true supersonic aircraft is a bit of a stretch. While it boasted speeds on paper up to Mach 1.8 and supposedly reached Mach 1.7 in one instance thanks to its afterburning Tumansky R11 turbojets, it rarely exceeded Mach 1 in most variants, as the controls were prone to seize up. In other words, it was essentially a Soviet bid to strap an overly powerful engine to a subsonic design. As the story goes, there was a risk that if you actually tried pushing the aircraft above Mach 1, you were basically just along for the ride. The aircraft's controls were prone to lock up once transonic, and if they did respond, movements had to be very soft.
It's unclear what G-loading the airframe was rated for, but it must have been quite low. Even a slight pull too hard could tear the wings off. The fact that this structural issue wasn't noted during testing is surprising, yet mass production continued on several core variants beginning in 1960. The Brewer A and B, or Yak-28 B and L respectively, would fill the tactical bomber role, with the former using an early radar for ranging, or, in its earliest form off the production line, simply a telescopic sight, and the latter relying on radio triangulation from ground placements. These would use the R11 AF300 engines, the same ones noted for their inefficient intakes. Both would later be replaced in the role by the improved Yak-28I, or Brewer C, which featured far more advanced internal systems, including an autopilot, new engines, and a better radar with more advanced ground mapping capabilities. Training roles would be handled by the Yak-28U, or Maestro, which had been overhauled with a second cockpit. Of all variants, the Maestro would remain in service the longest. The recon role would be filled by the Yak-28R, or Brewer D, a redesigned version of the 28I, which would utilize an innovative loading method. Recon kits, available in several configurations, could be fitted into the aircraft in pallets. Finally, the Yak-28P, or Firebar, would fill the crucial interceptor role, beginning testing in 1960. The Firebar would push the airframe to its limits. While most airframes were rated for Mach 1, the Firebar was rated for Mach 1.8 and was claimed to have reached Mach 1.7 during one flight. It would have a service ceiling of 55,000 feet, and thanks to bombing components being stripped, no internal guns, and added fuel stores, an effective range of around 1,500 miles. Similar to the Phantom pairing with the AIM-7 Sparrow, the Firebar would integrate its own new medium-range missile, the R-98 Anab, which could be fitted with either semi-active radar guidance or infrared guidance. Two could be carried, alongside two shorter-range K-13 Atolls for close-in fighting. Powering the aircraft was the new R11-AF2-300 engine, which would also find its way into later strike and recon variants, namely the Brewer C and D. Unlike the early R11AF's 11,200 pounds of thrust per engine, the AF2 would increase this to 13,670 pounds of thrust. Crucially, it would also feature a better nacelle design, which was arguably the main limiting factor in the original engine. In the years that followed, the aircraft was modified to do just about everything, from an interceptor to a Mark II X-plane, and even to the Soviet Union's first dedicated electronic warfare platform. The Yak-28RR would be a nuclear reconnaissance and data collection platform, the 28UVP, an STOL testbed, and later the 28VV, a similar testbed for VTOL launches. Two particularly notable concepts would also emerge. The 28 TARC, a photographic reconnaissance platform that featured an early live broadcast capability, allowing the crew to send a video feed of their target back to base. The other was the 28 PM, a heavily upgraded Firebar, which was claimed to have reached close to Mach 2 during testing. Yet of all these, the definitive offshoot would be the Yak-28 PP, or Brewer E, which emerged in 1970. It would be the first specialized electronic warfare platform to enter Soviet use. While largely overlooked, this was arguably the most impressive model delivered, sent out alongside bombers, initial other Brewers, and later Fencers. The 28 PP would use a configuration method similar to the Recon models, with components loaded into the bomb bay in a large rectangular box. To target specific frequency bands, 2 primary jamming suites were on board, the Bouquet, available in 3 units, and the Fasol one, available in 4. This would allow a flight to be sent up, with each aircraft jamming a different frequency. For self-defense, it had standard chaff and flares, an RWR system that could trigger countermeasures called Serena 3, and an ECM suite, supposedly tailored to jam the MIM-23 Hawk, known as Lilac, which was available in 3 modules. Finally, there was the S-5P, a rocket that could be launched in front of the aircraft, detonating after launch and releasing a cloud of chaff. These electronics were kept cool by installing 2 heat exchangers, and several other visual changes were evident on the aircraft.
In the West, the aircraft would be best remembered for one incident. In 1966, Brewer crew, Captain Boris Kapustin and Lieutenant Yuri Yanov, experienced a catastrophic failure over East Berlin. Losing control, the aircraft strayed into West Berlin, and, rather than eject, the crew sacrificed themselves to steer it away from built-up housing, steering it into a lake. The crew were returned with full military honours to the USSR, and the RAF would review the crashed Yak.
The incident was somewhat symbolic of the platform as a whole. A stopgap that put lives at risk whenever it was flown. The problems it had were numerous, extending far beyond transonic handling issues. At a low level, it was a similar story. Poor handling was exacerbated, and the airframe's poor structural integrity was even more pronounced under heavy loads. Together, this limited its ability to even operate as an effective conventional bomber. It was also supposed to flex at odd points. One claim holds that if the cockpit was left open during loading, the canopy would sometimes jam when the pilot tried to close it. The problems faced seemed to indicate that the design had been an attempt to tick boxes, pushing too much into what was, at its core, a fundamentally outdated design. It had been built using 1940s principles, without integrating newer methods such as area ruling, more advanced intakes, and blending. This compromise for meeting goals also seems evident in the wing. Despite its older shaping, it was heavily swept, more than the Vautour, which was generally avoided and seemingly done as a workaround for transonic flight. On the upside, the outboard podded engines offered separation in case something went wrong, but even then, they posed their own risks. Interestingly, issues with this design approach were likely recognized by the mid to late 50s due to problems B-58 crews had experienced. Engine failures, for example, led to pronounced asymmetry and, at times, catastrophic failure, something that would have been even more pronounced on the delicate Yak airframe with its highly swept wing. All these choices indicated that the Yak had probably been both a byproduct and a victim of political pressure. Designers, likely working as best they could, drew up a plane that could do most of what was asked of it, on a budget and under a time limit. And to its credit, the Yak could technically do what it was asked to do. It was just a question of how risky it would be. As noted earlier, there were probably other reasons that led to it taking the form it did. Using old design methods, getting it to fly off the drawing board would have been relatively easy, with minimal R&D, in theory. In practice, however, development proved difficult, with engineers in Irkutsk describing a complex, inefficient process of refinements and redesigns to pull everything together. If the goal was simply to fill a gap in large numbers, this indeed worked. What's more, the Soviet military's decision to push it into mass production, regardless of reliability, may have been justified. Certain Soviet battle doctrines at the time assumed that aircraft wouldn't last long in an all-out European war. In such a case, numbers mattered. A similar logic was likely applied to the interceptor role, one that had to be filled regardless of what was available. Regardless, the Yak-28 would eventually be replaced, and its roles handed off to other platforms. From reconnaissance to interception to strike, new jets, ranging from the Foxbat to the MiG-27, could do all of these better. As a bomber, its primary replacement would be the Su-24 Fencer, a better performer all round. As the Fencer took over these responsibilities, the platform would primarily live on in its electronic warfare variant, which was paired with the new Sukhoi to assist it in its bombing role, and the Maestro trainer, which lived on until the fall of the Soviet Union. Yet the question remains, was the Yak-28 actually any good? It was certainly a stopgap solution. With few particularly forward-thinking design principles, it seems to have been an attempt to force everything the military was asking for into a single package. To put it into perspective, the Yak-28's first flight was in the same year as the F-4 Phantom, an aircraft that could fill roughly the same tasking, albeit far more reliably. Nevertheless, the Yak-28 technically filled the gap. It was affordable, mass-produced, and in a war could theoretically have done its job.
Where it would shine was as an electronic warfare platform, the first of its class in the Soviet Union, and the role it performed without issue for many years. By the time the Fencer arrived, the Soviets had far better tactical bombing capabilities. And in the case of a war, it would probably have been supporting the bomber fleet as an EW platform, and that's where the Brewer would have shone.
Thanks for watching. Our videos are researched, written and produced by a small team of filmmakers dedicated to bringing you accurate military aviation history from around the world. Please consider supporting us by joining our merch and members site for early access, bonus content and merch discounts. Or become a YouTube channel member for early access, or simply hit subscribe. Your support means everything.